Here we go. Roll video.
I think anybody creating something new must have an adventure.
It's not cinema, it's something else.
My advice to a young filmmaker is to make a movie every week.
The whole bag of movies can be learned in about a day and a half.
But suspense is essentially an emotional process.
You gotta make films. You gotta make it and get it seen.
Cinema for me is a world of when I dream.
Hey everybody, welcome to Behind the Slate. My name is Aaron Strand, and my guest today is an author and scholar. In addition to teaching at Loyola University Chicago, he wrote the best-selling book, The Complete Idiot's Guide to Literary Theory and Criticism. He currently teaches at the prestigious Newberry Library in Chicago and just finished a 5-part seminar titled Chaplin, 5 Films. Stephen J. Venturino.
That's me. Thank you very much, Aaron. This is a terrific opportunity to just talk about Chaplin with someone who knows Chaplin and appreciates Chaplin, and has a lot of background. I'm looking forward to this. I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. I want to start off by just asking you, what was your introduction to Chaplin? When did you first see one of his films, and what did you think when you saw it?
Yeah, that's a good one. I would say when I was a kid, I probably saw, like a lot of people do, silent films on TV, and they were bad. You know, the quality was bad, and so on, and it wasn't that interesting. But I think it was probably around college, and this is now in the 80s. I saw City Lights, and City Lights just changed everything, because City Lights was a whole movie. It was a whole experience. It wasn't just Keystone Cops, and so that started it. And then I just went backwards from there. In my teaching, I did some film studies courses, so I was able to look at other Chaplin films, watch the development of the technology, allow people to see these films like they'd never seen them before. But everything, I think, began with City Lights.
What was your inspiration behind your recent seminar on Chaplin, and what did you hope to impart and teach to the participants?
I had done several seminars at the Newberry Library, I still do, and generally about Victorian literature. Actually, I do serial readings of long novels, the kinds of novels that are 800 pages long by Dickens or George Eliot. And what we do is we read them over 8 weeks, 8 or 9 weeks even, in parts as they were sort of originally published. And then we discuss them. We talk about the books before we're finished, rather than like a college course where you finish a whole 800-page novel and then you sit down and you say, "What'd you think?" And everyone says, "That was good. I didn't like the ending," and so on. But instead, we break it up, and if people are able to talk about their experiences with the novel and not knowing how it's going to end all the way through, that led to my interest in film in a similar way, to watch films with people in the seminars, and to consider them, specifically silent films, because that is, to really answer the question, it's because silent films are a whole nother experience than people are used to. And it takes a while for people to understand that. They're not just movies without sound. They're a whole immersive experience of watching the screen and looking at things that we normally don't look at as closely in film. So I was really interested in doing that. I did a seminar on silent film in general, where we hit all the high points with films, but then decided that Chaplin was just too good, and that there were 5 films, the later films, the big ones, if I could say, except for The Circus, which people could see and we could discuss and get into a little bit of the history of his life as well, because the period of the films where we were seeing ran from 1921 to 1940, and those are, just to say the least, the busy times. So that was the idea, to help people see each of those films with a lot of context and time to discuss.
Certainly. Now, I'm assuming that some of your students had never seen a silent film before taking your class. What were some of the preconceptions that people have about silent films, and how do you overcome that? How do you bring them into that world?
It's time. It just takes a little bit of time and defamiliarizing. We really defamiliarize from the beginning. You know, there are people who do silent films. They'll say the first thing they were never silent. There was always music. There was sometimes sound effects, and then of course in the Chaplin films there's sound like that. But but they were never silent. And the second tip is not to wait for the intertitles. That is to say that the intertitles don't tell you something that you mostly haven't already seen. The faces tell you what's going on. But when people first come to silent films, they watch them too fast. They're not into the film. They're not really staring at the screen and looking with their eyes around at the little details of the faces and of the exchanges. And so, but it takes maybe one film and one discussion for people to realize this is not like regular films. And they all say that, whether it's college students or at the Newberry, we have a lot of people who have careers and they have other jobs, but they're interested in seeing something new. And they all have the same reaction, which is these films are different. They require a different way of watching, and they really enjoy it.
I had a couple friends who went and saw, I don't know what it was, maybe a Buster Keaton film with like a live musical accompaniment, and they're not cinephile people, they're not movie people, and hearing them talk about the magic of going to see a silent film and the attention that it required, the sort of meditative space that it draws you into, was so filled my heart with joy to hear, because in some ways, being a movie lover who has seen a lot of silent films, I've almost sometimes I take it for granted how special the experience can be. Have you seen that with your students as well?
Yeah, and first, that is perfectly put. That is exactly the way to say it, to describe the reaction that people have. I love that, the terms you've used. I really find that. In fact, we found in the seminar that we saw the Gold Rush, and the Gold Rush, Chaplin's Gold Rush, when it first came out, was a silent film in 25, and then he remade it in 1942 with a narration. So Chaplin himself, is speaking over the silent film that he had made years before, like almost like a newsreel, and it's got sound effects, and he does voices for some of the characters when they're speaking dialogue, which in the earlier film was indicated by titles or nothing, because viewers could understand what was happening. And when people got to that film, they'd only seen two films, I think, already, or possibly even one, but they had been in that, they realized that meditative state that you talk about, that sense of concentration and even trust in looking at the screen, was not there for the 1942 version. They didn't want to hear somebody talking through the film. They wanted to get back to the silent film immersion, the silent film experience. And I thought that was neat, because that's really the goal. But it's not to say that any kind of film is better or worse, but to recognize that it's a different bird. It requires a different way of watching.
Yeah, that's amazing. It makes me think, today, like, Netflix is producing content designed so that you can just like have it on in the background. It's like they're specifically designing background content because they're assuming everybody's watching, like, and then looking at their phone and scrolling through Instagram or Twitter or whatever, and like they hear the story in the background, but they don't really need to pay attention. You cannot do that with a silent film. Like, you will miss it.
That's exactly right. There's no other cues. And if you look away even for a moment, it sort of breaks the spell. You've lost the track of what's happening. And at first, I think I have a particular friend whose name I won't mention, but she doesn't like that. For that matter, she doesn't like what she calls black and white films, that kind of approach. And that's fine too. People be people. Everybody's great. But the silent film work, it's probably a reaction. People feel like they have to work too hard to watch and study and see what's happening. But it's a really quick, or what's the term? Easy learning curve, a steep learning curve, whatever. It's fast. Once you see one, once you've done it and even discussed it with people, then you really crave it. Then you really want to stare at the screen, not have anything on in the background, and watch what all the different parts of the film that go into delivering not just meaning, but emotion.
How has exposure and appreciation for silent films changed both the way that you watch, more modern movies, and also for the people in your class? How have you heard how their viewing experience has changed.
It's a great tool, I would say, for anybody who's interested in talking about films. It doesn't matter where, in school or in movie groups. If people want to get together, like with the book groups or whatever. Silent films help you see things, film techniques, help you really appreciate film techniques, because some of that other stuff isn't around. The sound isn't there, or the dialogue rather doesn't accompany the film. You have to be attuned to editing. You have to see that cuts mean something, that reaction shots, eye line matches, all of the things that anybody can talk about with any film, I think are sort of, you're invited as a silent film watcher to notice that more. And that I think that changes things, because if you watch a few silent films, then watch any contemporary movie, you see more of what's going on in the contemporary movie. It helps defamiliarize, to use that term again, so-called regular films, because you can see what's going on in a regular film that Chaplin might have done, or that Keaton might have done, or so on. And Lois Weber. I mean, Lois Weber's what's that film? Suspense. It's like 9 minutes long, and really early silent film, and it's got all the building blocks of movies in it: the chase scene, the suspense.
Yeah, they like in cinephile circles, you'll throw around terms today like pure cinema. And it's talking about these moments without dialogue in modern film when this magic takes over. And I think, I think what they're really trying to say is that the real power of cinema, both in the silent era and today, is that through the screen, it's like doing surgery on someone's psyche. And all of a sudden you can see what they're thinking without them having to say it. It's about the story buried in the subtext. And that is what is the truly kind of pleasurable moment of a film. And but it was being done all in the teens and 20s, and we almost like discredit it because the frame rate isn't consistent, or it moves a little too fast.
That's just the case. That having access to an internal life, to emotions, to the thoughts of the characters, and knowing they're there, not just in a general way. I mean, you can stare at any film, any characters on film, and know that they must be thinking something. But the way that the artists want to really communicate something through a silent film, through those faces, comes across in silent films. And that's the link to, by the way, to Victorian literature. I mean, reading Victorian literature, anybody is struck by how cinematic it is, how the language itself, of course, goes into people's psyches, and into their emotions, and it helps you see that. But there's also, especially in Dickens, a lot of positioning of the reader visually and spatially, so that like you're reading a Dickens novel and you're not just like picking up content. It's not just Once Upon a Time, but it's almost as if the narrator has put you on stage while a play is going on and turns you around to say, now look at what this character is saying, and turn this way and look at what that character is saying. And that's what film will later do in the 20th century. It's really neat, that manipulation of internal states, only purely with external tools.
That's amazing. I'm very ignorant of Victorian literature, but obviously Chaplin is a product of the late Victorian era and was hugely influenced by Dickens. At least claims to have been an avid reader, although we know some of his other reading claims are somewhat suspicious. But are there any other sort of Dickensian, do you think, like parallels between Dickens and Chaplin's later work?
Yeah, I do. There's a whole book, actually. It's right behind me, in this world of the podcast. There's all kinds of things behind me, but one of them is a book called Dickens and Cinema, because it was recognized by early filmmakers, silent filmmakers, including Chaplin, that Dickens was writing shooting scripts. He was writing directions for, as I said, where to direct the viewer's gaze, how to focus on a detail like a close-up, and then when to jump back, for a medium shot or a wide shot. It's really neat how effective Dickens' language is for that. And Chaplin knew that. Chaplin read Dickens. His favorite, I think, was Oliver Twist, which is fine. Mine is Little Dorrit, but they all taught, those novels really taught early filmmakers what to do. Sergei Eisenstein wrote essays specifically about Dickens, and how individual words and phrases in Dickens' works, specifically a little story called "Cricket on the Hearth," um, set up places for the camera to point. In Eisenstein's mind, he was saying, "Look what this guy's doing before film. Look what Dickens is doing. He's imagining a kind of storytelling that really requires film. He just doesn't have it yet." So I think Eisenstein, Chaplin, a lot of the filmmakers recognized that they could take their cues from this other medium, and of course that getting to internal states because of an external device. An external device. The book is an external device, and it certainly gets to the heart of people's emotions and thoughts.
Why do you think Chaplin's work has held up so well over time when other contemporary superstars, maybe more on the dramatic side, like Douglas Fairbanks or Mary Pickford, haven't held up as well?
I don't know. Some folks have said recently in the seminar that it's the narrative coherence. The movie is those movies are really unified. So unlike Buster Keaton, maybe that might be a little too episodic. Chaplin's are more cohesive, but that's not always true either. Chaplin's got these gags, a series of gags. Even in the Great Dictator, he's got gags that have to play out like little mini stories within the film. I don't know. I think it's that combination of sentiment and really sincere compassion for the underdog. I mean, it's easy to do in films and it's easy to play, but Chaplin did it from the beginning of his career. This concern for the people who don't have a lot of power, and he's always punching up, if anything, or at least offering a helping hand down. And I think that just sticks with people. It keeps coming back as something that's important to see. I meant to ask, and not to interrupt, but when did you first see Chaplin? Because it's probably a small generational difference.
I didn't see his films as a kid that I can remember. I think just after college, and at the time, the Criterion Collection was on Hulu. This was around 2010, and I remember one night sitting down. I think I watched a double feature of John Ford's Stagecoach and City Lights one night.
Wow.
Wow. And first time seeing both films. I know, I'm so jealous of myself. I wish I could watch those movies for the first time all over again. It was incredible. City Lights was also my first exposure. It just blew my mind. And then I really dove all in because I was hired to play the Fool in a filmed version of King Lear, which was an independently produced film of King Lear. And the director wanted a very physical version of the Fool. And so in looking for sort of physical inspiration, I think I started with like watching more Marx Brothers films, but eventually found my way to Chaplin. And that over the course of that production, which was about 2.5 months, I think I watched all the features. Didn't really get into the shorts so much. They were still kind of inaccessible to me. A lot of them I hadn't seen until I started doing this podcast. That was my full-on immersion for Chaplin, and that was probably in about my mid-20s.
That's really cool. The physicality is something else, because again, people can compare Keaton and Chaplin and this whole idea of slapstick, and pratfalls and all that. But Chaplin's different, and that's interesting to hear, because you could study. I mean, not one, but you could study Chaplin's movements for a part that to think about how your body is moving and what that conveys to people. Chaplin was very careful about that. People have said over and over how much like a dancer he was. Everything was like a dance.
Absolutely. And I think he's an actor's actor. I mean, he's really trying to cut the acting out of his performance. We think of silent comedy is this kind of mugging, big faces, and Chaplin wanted to get rid of all that. He was trying to strip everything away.
Yeah, he really was. And he really believed in pantomime. I mean, he really believed in that. And because that's the same idea, thinking today's audiences may be thinking the pantomime is over the top, making faces. Like the scene in Singing in the Rain. What does she say? Then Debbie Reynolds says, you're just making faces, dumb show, and she makes faces. And Gene Kelly says, yo, you mean like what I do? And that's fine, and that can happen. But Chaplin really believed in the power of that pantomime, how you can really draw people in with movement.
It was a novelty, and I think his power was undeniable in America. But in Britain, where the history of pantomime was a bit more in tune with the culture, and the culture's so much more theatrical than it is here in the States, I think that they could appreciate it a little bit more. Have you read Winston Churchill's essay on Chaplin?
Not all of it.
It's wonderful because of Churchill. I mean, it's just positively Churchillian, and he's talking about pantomime as the oldest theater, form of theater, going all the way back to the Romans, and he kind of drolls on about the majesty of pantomime and how Chaplin, takes this multi-thousand-year-old art form and has elevated it to heights never before imaginable.
It's a really difference in the culture, and even in France, the whole European sort of, not to denigrate anybody in the United States, but the European tradition, as you say, of theatricality and accepting it, what its range can be, and then seeing what the early film people were doing with it.
Yeah, do you know? I'm a little. I mean, my research touched upon it some, but I know that those early French comedies were a big influence, particularly on Max Sennett and the Keystone style. I guess those were sort of early screwball type physical comedies, right? And kind of French clowning traditions. Do I have that correct?
Yeah, the whole Commedia dell'arte and even the Punch and Judy and the just the action and the fast paced the sort of violence, mild violence, and all is part of that. But everyone, you can direct that to kids, you can direct that to simple farce, or you can recognize that farce is never simple. That are always not always that way. That pratfalls aren't always just pratfalls. There's a beautiful pratfall in, just to really change subjects, Dr. Strangelove, where George C. Scott, is the general, and he's walking backwards and he's saying something, and he does a double somersault or something, or a single somersault backwards, and then pops up on his feet, just like an old Commedia dell'arte character. But he's saying serious things, and of course the film's about the destruction of the planet.
These art forms keep popping up, and there is an eternal relevance to them. I think it's important to note the lineage of where they come from.
And yeah, they've been around for so long, they have to be doing something. It's like fairy tales or anything else. I mean, the archetypes they still work. I mean, there's no. I mean, you could look at anything going on right now, and they're still built on the same principles.
Now, I want to jump ahead a little to talk about modern times. I'm curious, in your recent seminar, what was your sort of with that film? How did you present it, and what were some of the feedback you were getting from your students?
Well, we were moving from The Kid. We first saw The Kid, full on silent, but with the soundtrack, or rather the score that Chaplin himself composed in '72. But The Kid, and then the Gold Rush, both versions of that we took a look at, followed by City Lights, which was not really the farewell to sound, even though it came out after sound films. There was that. Modern Times is the farewell to sound. I mean, to silent films. And that's how we really approached it. I wanted to see, and we all wanted to see, what Chaplin was doing after the sound era emerged, after the silent films that made him rich, and that also showed him the promise of silent films. And he really believed in it. I mean, that's where City Lights came from. He said, I know I could make a sound film, but I don't want to make a sound film. And look how powerful this one can be in 1931. And then in 36, he does it again with Modern Times, but he knows at this point that it's probably his last. And so I wanted to see what he did with sound, with the sound effects, and the way that thematically all of this, all of the most of the examples of dialogue in that film are belligerent or hostile or alienating. There's the guy in the screen, the boss who looks like Henry Ford is yelling. The first words I think in the film, something like "Speed it up, get back to work." Whenever anybody says anything for real or in language, in connected language, like a sound film, it's not good. It doesn't help people come together. Uh, and what does the film shows us is either silence or nonsense, like the nonsense song at the end. And this is the film, the famous film where Chaplin, the little tramp walks away with a companion. He doesn't walk down the street alone at the end of the film. He walks away with Paulette Goddard. And they don't know where they're going, but they're going off into a new future, as all films would be doing. So I wanted to see how the themes of that, how Chaplin is so sincere about silence still, that is to say, non-dialogue, how sincere he was about how important that was still. And no matter what movies we're going to do in the future, he wanted to show that you can do a lot without dialogue. I mean, and you can almost feel the way he's reacting with Paulette Goddard, how comfortable he is, I think, to be sitting in a position to say, I can do anything I want. I mean, he was paying for all of his movies out of his own pocket. He did that, and Great Dictator. They were all just independent projects. There was no studio system supporting him, so he could really indulge and understand, take a broad view of his own career, his own personal life, and I think you can feel that.
I think the relative calmness of his personal life compared to his kind of manic, wild days of the 20s really is felt in the film. The film has this just easy quality, moving from one to the other, or moving from one sequence to another. I also think that both City Lights and Modern Times, but really Modern Times, it was criticized at the time when it came out as sort of, Upton Sinclair said, well, this is just Chaplin's old bits recycled. And I could totally get a contemporary audience feeling that way. But as a modern film viewer, I'm so grateful, because I think that Chaplin went through his back catalog, took out all the gems from Keystone and S&A and Mutual, got the best bits and kind of recombined them into a cohesive narrative, and left us with this heightened highlight reel of silent comedy. And of course, the comparisons are not one to one, but I think it's like he's creating this sort of capstone for that entire era and his entire silent career. That works in many ways better than having to sift through the back catalog and find some beat up print of some film from 1916 to get all of his good stuff. And for that, I mean, I'm so grateful. I think what you're saying about the sort of meta awareness of silent versus sound is really smart, and it hadn't occurred to me that's actively what he was doing. I think that's really brilliant and had to have been a part of his thinking.
It must, when he was making it. I also like, just to circle back to that idea of not having to sift through like older films. I mean, when he's making Modern Times, no one could. You'd either see a film of his, an old film of his at the theater, or you didn't. The VCRs weren't out. The Wi-Fi was terrible in 36, but so it would be on his mind, just as you said, to say like, well, now I'm making a film, but some of these bits, so-called bits, they're not hackneyed bits, but they really belong in a new setting. These gems belong in a new setting, and that new setting was Modern Times, with all of its themes. I think he was thinking of that as his farewell, and that's why I think there's a couple of biographers who refer to it as the last time we'll see the tramp, and it really isn't, of course. I mean, I believe the tramp, in a way, I mean, in an important way, is in The Great Dictator. I mean, it looks like the tramp. Chaplin wants us to see that the Jewish barber is the tramp, at least in a setup way, so that he can then exit the stage as the barber. But I think he saw modern times as that capstone, as you say, as that way of saying, look at what we can do, not in a nostalgic way entirely, but look at the possibilities that are still here. The themes, of course, the political themes. What did somebody call them? Modern times is the gateway drug to more radical views about politics and socialism, and that, that's the period of time when people in government who were opposed to socialist ideas were really beginning to keep an eye on Chaplin. They were pointing out that he hasn't gotten himself into trouble so far, but he's on these points. He's pointing out the reason that people feel unsettled. He's pointing out the reason why people protest, and he's making that understandable to audiences. And there are a lot of people in power at the time who would prefer that nobody did that, and just purely demonize anyone who would want to protest. And here's the little tramp doing, as you say, doing what he's been doing for decades. But making it a force that moviegoers could identify with, and that was quite dangerous to a lot of people. So he's got this neat combination of the technical issues and the filmic, the cinematic issues, and the social issues, all wrapped up in modern times.
Absolutely. And that's a great point, because it's also his first post-code film. The first time he's having to go through the Hayes office to get approval. Now, much has been made of Chaplin's supposed communist ties, some going so far as to declare him a card-carrying member of the party. And a lot of people read these ideological affiliations into modern times. Now, I just don't see it. I see him as a guy who's, intellectually curious, a sort of intellectual elitist and socialist, sort of within his social circles. But I don't see this sort of hard line ideology in the film. I'm curious, what is your opinion about Chaplin's supposed communist ties and how they influenced modern times?
Yeah, it's such an important question, but it's also kind of a simple one to respond to in that film. I mean, in the film, he, as the character, the tramp, accidentally picks up that red flag at the end of there's a truck, construction vehicle, and it has a red flag simply to warn people away from the construction issues, and it falls off the truck. This red flag falls off the truck. Chaplin, or the tramp rather, picks it up and waves it at the truck driver to say, "Hey, you dropped your flag." What he's waving a red flag, and around the corner, of course, comes this parade of protesters, socialist protesters, workers. It was a workers' parade. And they naturally assume that he's carrying the red flag and he's their leader. That's like what was going on with Chaplin at the time. He was being demonized as a communist, as a card-carrying communist. And for some people, of course, that's the worst thing in the world. For others, myself included, no problem really being a card-carrying communist. That's just that there are important things to be done in the world that card-carrying communists can do. But that's hardly the end of social involvement. That's hardly the end of social interests. The range of socialisms, of having concern for workers' rights and individuals' rights goes much farther than card-carrying communism. And Chaplin himself never joined the Communist Party. He hung out with a lot of communists, but he always did so in a way that they recognize. And this is in the biographies more than a few times. His card-carrying communist friends were always a little impatient with him. They're like, "Come on, could you please say more? Could you be more doctrinaire?" And that's the line. He was never worried about dogma. He was never worried about the rules of communism. He was worried about the spirit. He was interested in the spirit of socialism and communism, and he didn't have the political answers. And so I think that's what made people on the right so worried about him on the one hand, but then so unable to blame him on the other, because he wasn't a communist, but he was doing things that would unsettle people, and that was tough. It's like they threw all kinds of charges at him in order to get to him, and this idea that he wasn't, just because he wasn't part of a particular party doesn't mean he wasn't dangerous to those in power, but it also means that he wasn't going to Tola line, and it shows. I think that, and, just to, sorry to interrupt and go back to why I think like Chaplin's films are still watched. That's another reason. I mean, you can look at something like Eisenstein again with Strike or October, and what's the Potemkin. Those are great, but I mean, there's a lot of attention to a kind of program there for social change. That has intellectuals, sitting around a table discussing how the differences and the niceties of that program. And Chaplin's less program and more spirit. He's more less what you should do than why you should do something. Chaplin is always trying to expose us to the reasons that social change is necessary, but he's not forcing us to see a particular path to make those changes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a excellent observation. As a filmmaker and artist myself, I'm always trying to glean, what lessons can we really learn from these great masters, more than just this shot looks good or this, whatever. And there's two things that we've touched upon in sort of the last like 10 minutes that I kind of want to circle back on that I think modern filmmakers could really stand to learn from Chaplin in this film. The first is that lack of ideological sort of hardline dependency, uh, and this sort of being aware of social injustice while also not necessarily prescribing the action to solve it. And the second is, we talked about this notion of modern times being a capstone to his career, that he's taking old gags, and yet you said it perfectly. It totally lacks sentimentality. Um, we're modern content is so awash in sentimentality. You have entire movies being created to just capture the sentiment behind some 90s, Christmas movie. I think Christmas Story 2, just came out, and it's just a total exercise in sentimentality. And yet Chaplin had the foresight to completely avoid these pitfalls and always try to get somewhere deeper with his stories.
Yeah, and sentimentality. There's an aspect of sentimentality that's kind of unavoidably conservative when you think about it. That is that when people, you're exposed to something sentimental, and you think that that might be neutral politically, but it really isn't. It allows people to feel good about or bad, and there are ways about things without really worrying about them, without being unsettled. It feeds into people's own emotions, and that's good. I mean, that can be good too, a catharsis kind of circumstance. Whereas Chaplin's always got an edge. All of his humor is there's a little danger, or a lot of danger in what the tramp does at times. He's always thumbing his nose at authority, at police. He's always, but he's not just doing it to be funny. He's pointing out how often, and I think it's probably in every film, every other film we've discussed, that he points out, not just saying it, not accusing anyone, but he just shows that the authority is often there to make sure that those who have keep what they have, and those who don't have stay out of it. That he's really showing that in most of his films, and that's not sentimental. There's funny and there's goofy and there's slapstick, but Chaplin always has this edge, I think, that reminds us that beneath the emotions that we're feeling, because you can, I'll fall apart at the end of City Lights every time, but there's a feeling there that there's an importance to the social bond that stays with you when you leave the theater. It's not just, as you say, watching a sequel after sequel and just sort of indulging in things you already know and already feel. You're challenged, I think, watching a Chaplin film.
Now, I want to take that and kind of move on to his next film, of course, The Great Dictator. Now, Chaplin made The Great Dictator at the outset of the Second World War, with pre-production happening before the Nazis even invaded Poland, and before so many of the horrors of the Nazis, came to many Americans' minds. How did he manage to capture so much truth about that regime and about fascism in general, all the way in 1938, 39, and of course 40 when the movie comes out?
Yeah, it's insane, isn't it? I mean, just to consider, and that was the reaction of the participants in the seminar by and large, was that this is an astonishing film. that it was made at all, that Chaplin did this. Um, I always felt that Chaplin knew a fascist when he saw one. He always did. His whole life, he knew what bad people, especially in power, can do. And there's a quote by Michael Wood that I included just last week when talking about this. That in this film, Michael Wood, the critic Michael Wood, is saying that, of course, everybody knows that he makes the dictator ridiculous. He makes the Hitler character and the Mussolini character look ridiculous, and that's all well and good. That's the funny part. But Michael Wood says it doesn't just make the dictator ridiculous, but he reminds us of how much harm even ridiculous people can do. And that's really important for what Chaplin was up to, because he saw the ridiculousness in Hitler. I mean, he grew up. Chaplin had the mustache first. That's the first thing people need to keep in mind. He had the mustache first, and it was Hitler who thought, "Hey, maybe if I have this funny little mustache, people will think of me nicer, or I'll get some of that that aura from Chaplin." They were born, what is it, 4 days apart? They had kind of similar upbringings. I mean, a lot of differences, but there's no question that in the 20s and in the 30s, people recognized that Hitler looked like Chaplin, and that Chaplin was going to have to do something about it at some point. And Chaplin had always wanted to make a Napoleon movie, for example. So he abandons that. Make a long story short, and he puts. I'll let you do the longer story longer, because it's really interesting, and I'm so interested in hearing what you have to say about that. I would love that. So he abandons most of the Napoleon story as Napoleon, but then moves it over to the Hitler story, because that's right in front of him, as you say. It was in 37, 38, 39 when he's making that film. And there are horrible things happening. Now, it's true that the full extent of what was happening was not known. And there's a famous line from Chaplin. He says, "If I had known the extent of the horrors of the concentration camps, I never could have made The Great Dictator." And that's true. But as he's making it, more and more information is coming out. And Jews knew in this country what was happening. The public may not be talking about it in the papers, but people knew really how bad this was. And you can see just by watching the film that Chaplin knows how vicious the regime was. So he wanted to make a statement, and that's what's astonishing, because why would you? If it's his own money, he could do anything he wants, but he had to make that film. Even he says that, and I think that just shows a lot of integrity as an artist to say that I'm going to make that film, and it shows a lot of prescience. People will say that with hindsight, how much we see these days. But I think what's particularly lauded and noteworthy is how Chaplin saw it then. He understood it in 1940, how bad it was and how important it was to make a stand. He says that in the New York Times. He had an article in the New York Times published in 1940 when the film came out, sort of defending the ending, for example, or the politics of that film, saying to people, "Look, I want to make a statement." And he literally says, "We need to take a stand." And that's good. That's very good. And in these times, it's good to know that we don't have to wait until the worst happens to take a stand.
Yeah, I mean, it's just amazing. And to think that also he was going to take this stand while also simultaneously making the leap into talking films, something he
That's
had
right.
resisted for a decade.
Yeah.
It's just incredible. How do you think that jump into talkies kind of affected this this incredibly courageous piece of art?
Yeah, that was huge. That's a really good point, because the two are I mean, they are happening again. It's sort of like he's coming back. Chaplin's coming back after the farewell of modern times, because he has to and do this. One of the things that has come up in our discussions in the seminars is the naming rather of characters in Chaplin films. It's the tramp, the gamine. They don't have names like George, and so on. And why is that? And one answer is that they're types. They're supposed to be more like types, archetypes, or general figures rather than specific characters. But in this film, they're specific. They're specifically named with those hilarious names, Napoleonian, Hinkle, and so on. They're really good. But they're also named because they are individual people. He does want to point fingers and say these are the people as individuals who are causing this problem. Of course, there are types who are like that as well. But I think Chaplin realized that he had to do two things with this film. One is point fingers at real people, individuals, and not pull any punches. And the other was to own up to sound, the usefulness of sound, in that the screams in this film. There's not a lot of dialogue, even so, in this film, and a lot of the action carries the emotion, the dance-like movements when they're being chased, for example, on the street corner. I remember one example when the Hinkle, or the Hitler guy, is talking over the speakers, and he's yelling, and the way he yells is like a song, and the way that Chaplin and Paulette Goddard have to dodge that voice down the street, it really is beautiful. It's like a choreographed scene of menace, and that's all done with sound. Chaplin is saying to everyone, look, there are good things you can do with sound, and I'm going to show you some of those good things that we can do with sound. And as I said, the screams and the violence of the film would not be the same in a silent film. So I think, ironically, perhaps, or tragically, Chaplin found one of the greatest uses of a sound in a sound film, of sound in a sound film, was to give an audience a very sobering feeling about violence.
This had never really occurred to me, but I always find it so interesting how quickly or slowly artists adapt to technological innovations. You always have those early first adopters, and then you'll also have the resistors, right? And Chaplin was both in his lifetime. He was kind of jumped into uh, film as a medium, at least relatively early in his career. Film had been around for some time, but he's right there when Los Angeles is just becoming a movie making center. So he had been an early adopter, and yet obviously resisted sound for about a decade, whereas Adolf Hitler embraced sound, and it was key to his mass media empire. And it's almost as if Chaplin, during that time of resistance, and maybe it was just, maybe he was scared, maybe it was just personal gripes or whatever, but at some point he must have sat back and started to observe how sound was affecting the population and how sound was affecting culture. And that restraint led him to be able to make this incredibly pointed statement and to try to undo the evils of that sound had allowed Hitler to do with this film. Do you think that's a part of his thinking here?
That's great. Yes, I mean, he's really, and some have said he's reclaiming the tramp from anything, any interference Hitler may have caused. Absolutely. I mean, it's new technologies often hide old habits, and Chaplin knew that. That just because you're doing something new technically doesn't mean you're doing something new thematically or emotionally or socially. Or in fact, sometimes it's very often it's the opposite. The new technology just gets taken up in the service of a very old program. And I think that's what you were describing, the way that Chaplin wasn't an early adopter, but he was a thoughtful adopter. Whereas some of the early adopters just rushed into making sentimental films, musicals. And I love those musicals, by the way, of those times, those earliest ones. I mean, is that another podcast I'd like to hear about, is what's it called? Nelson Eddy and the other one, Jeanette MacDonald. Those musicals, those are great, and the whole thing with Lubitsch. Anyway, those are wonderful. But then there's a lot of, again, reactionary stuff, or just sort of casual conservative stuff you can do with new technologies. But no, as you said, Chaplin was he was right there. He appreciated in the 20s, in the teens, what film could do, and others were thinking of it as a silly entertainment. I mean, just to take your point a little further, I mean, he developed film. He helped show, film is not just a silly little diversion. It's a real art form, and Chaplin was responsible for helping people realize that.
You brought up the New York Times article. It's amazing to think that upon its release, Chaplin had to defend the final speech. I mean, this is now considered, one of the great moments of cinema, or greatest speeches in film history. But at the time, people did not know what to do with it. first of all, what do you think accounts for that reaction in 1940? And furthermore, how has that speech appreciated over time, and what does it have to teach us today?
Well, the lure of film, I mean, you just, no matter how expert one is, like at cinema, there come times where you just sit and the old expression, you lose yourself in the film. You're just there in the film, and you're paying less attention to some of the details. And that can happen even in The Great Dictator. And I think that was interesting to hear from some of the participants in the seminar, thinking that when they got to the end and they heard that speech, even they would say that was disruptive. That seemed out of character. Now, they're not saying it in a bad way, like many critics did, because many critics did say that was just ridiculous. Why would you come out and say that? It's really breaking the fourth wall. And as you've said, to which Chaplin's response is, yeah, yes, it sure was, because I want to. And he also said, what is this film? Is like it's an hour and 7 minutes long, or I mean 2 hours or something and 7 minutes long. If 2 hours and 3 minutes are funny, then give me my 4 minutes to pontificate. There's that, but I think that I think part of it is that people who don't want to hear that message play up their dismay at its artful, or the way it's not artful. I don't think it strikes them as that unartful. It's actually prepared for us in the film. There's a scene in the middle where Paulette Goddard turns and looks right at the camera and says, "What if they just left us alone? Wouldn't it be great if we could go back? We could stay in this country and we wouldn't have to leave. Wouldn't that be nice?" And she's looking right at the camera. And some people watch that scene and they say, well, she's doing that thing you do in film where you kind of gaze off into space and talk to yourself. But she's not. She's talking directly to the camera in the way that Chaplin will at the end of the film. And that's the other thing that's so meta about this movie. I mean, Chaplin knew he had to cross lines, break the fourth wall, walk out and say things so that people would, on the one hand, be lured into the film as a fiction, but then always remember where the edges are, where the boundaries are, because outside the boundaries of the theater is this tragedy, is an absolute atrocity in an international situation, in the international situation. So I think he was perfectly justified in doing that. I think most people recognize that it's a terrific statement that he makes at the end of the film, even when it ramps up and he begins to talk quickly and almost sound more like the Hinkle or Hitler character himself, thereby reminding us that, and Chaplin himself said it, but but for the grace of God, go I, that he, with all of his power, Chaplin with all of his power, could have turned that power and charisma and manipulation to horrible ends, like Hitler did. But Chaplin was always aware of Hitler's theatricality and the way that Hitler was doing things that Chaplin was doing as well, but for terribly different ends. I like the speech at the end. I think it's fascinating, and I think it's a really good way to end that film, because it doesn't end the film in the film. It ends the film by pointing you out into the world.
It's an amazing jump into sort of didactic narrative rather than purely emotional experience, which had been his bread and butter. I mean, it's guaranteeing that people leave the theater talking about it, right? And you feel compelled to ask your date or your friends, what did you think about that? I mean,
that's right.
And that conversation starter is pretty incredible.
Really incredible. I mean, it'd be incredible for 1940. It's incredible now. People weren't quite sure, and sometimes in the seminar what we're supposed to be talking about, but it really worked. I mean, that is to say, how loud one's criticism or how obvious one's criticism can be. But I mean, let's face it, we live in a world where where we really have fascists with some charisma causing a lot of trouble, and that needs to be addressed.
Yeah. How do you feel that Chaplin's speech, or just The Great Dictator as a whole, kind of speaks to our modern era? What, either maybe just you as an individual, what do you take from the film living today in 2022?
Yeah, that's that statement about, and he says it in the speech, I think, doesn't he? How technologies that are designed to bring us together are doing just the opposite. I mean, that's clearly applicable to everything around us. The internet, is supposed to be bringing us closer together, and it often creates these little groups, these little cohorts of terribleness, and also of goodness. I mean, the bonding that goes on in small groups, but the way that the far right groups in this world are able to find each other and think of themselves as being more dignified and having more numbers and having more respect than they really do is partly due to the technology. The internet. I mean, it used to be if you were really mean, angry, and if you were a psychopath, you'd run down the street and say things, or you'd publish things on your own with some paper, and six people would see it. These days, of course, you can get any message out, and there will always be people who will say, "You're right. I've been thinking the same thing," no matter how vicious or mean-spirited your message is. And I think that's what he was speaking to in 1940. Chaplin, went through a period of several periods of retrospection and dismay, thinking that here was America, this great country that he came to, feeling that it was going to help the world. In the 20s and even into the 30s, he really had felt the promise of America. And through the 30s, that began to wane because he could see, again, the waste, the use that people were putting their technologies to was not good. And beyond not good, it was bad. And then, of course, the onset of the war just shows technologies only being used to kill people or to control people, and that's just not good. And that's still happening now. So my takeaway from that is like this fight is still out there, and it's not going to end. Therefore, like Chaplin, what do you do before? He's not making this film in 1945. He's not making this film when the Allies go in and see what's going on in the camps. He's making this film when there's a lot at stake in terms of people pointing at you and saying, "You're overreacting. Things aren't so bad. This isn't your war. This is Europe's war. This is all about the Jews." He says, "No, this is my problem." And I think that's what people should feel today about what's going on with the far right and the fascist programs, real programs, not just fascist feelings, but fascist programs and politics, local politics and school boards, the way that people feel they have this really loud voice to shut down other people. It's terrible. So I think that a film like that can help, I think, identify us with the underdogs who can still take a stand.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I absolutely agree. Just to kind of wrap up here, what would you say to somebody who has never seen a Chaplin film, maybe is on the fence about pressing play on their streaming app or even going to a theater if a theater is lucky enough to be playing one? What would you say to them to convince them that these old movies, and particularly the work of Charlie Chaplin, is still worth watching?
They've got to watch it. Watch anything. I'd say City Lights is a great way to start. City Lights is just a really interesting film because it plays with sight and as a theme, the ideas of sight and blindness, and so it's really made for a silent film. It's made to both engage a viewer thinking about what they're seeing on the screen and what the screen is telling them about the message of what it means to see. And the way you can communicate without dialogue. It's written into the film, and that's not all true of every silent film. Silent films can be great, but they're not all about that. It's almost like City Lights is a film about silent film in a good way. But the first advice is simply just to, I don't know, take it slow. Find even if you're watching an hour-long movie, and that's right, an hour long, but take 20 minutes and just don't do anything but watch the film. You don't have to kill yourself or go crazy or do anything too serious, but just don't let any other distractions get to you. And as I mentioned earlier at the beginning, that one or two times doing that, one or two sessions of doing that, kind of, it hooks you. You realize it's not work, it's not hard, but it's the opposite. It's pleasurable to enjoy that, but it's not familiar to people. So I'd say sit down to City Lights, watch the first 20 minutes, watch The Immigrant or Soldier Arms for shorter films of Chaplin's, but do it without distractions. Get a good print, listen to the music that's being played while you're watching the film, because they always had something accompanying them. And just enjoy what it is that you're looking at. Just take it as a very strange. Maybe that's it. I'll go all the way back, and here's the last thing I'll say. think of it as a strange experience. Don't think of it as another thing to watch on a screen, another thing to do that's familiar to you. Every time I watch a new silent film, because they're also all different. We talk about silent films like people talk about books, like, oh, you like reading? How about reading this? Like, there are lots of different things to read, and there are a lot of different silent films. So whenever I see anything new, I need to say, this is different. This is going to be strange. I need to see what it's all about.
I love that. I love that so much. Do you have an upcoming seminar? Are you working on anything in for the upcoming year?
My plans are to listen to you as often as possible. I have really liked this this conversation and listening to what you've had to say. It's just this is great. But as far as seminars, let's see. What do I have? I'm going to do another serial reading of Charles Dickens' David Copperfield. That's coming up in after the first of the year, and there are a lot of film versions of Copperfield. You know, the one with Harry Potter as a kid or whatever, and then there's a new one with Dev Patel that's really good. So we'll be looking at the film versions of Copperfield and that, and then I'm doing 3 films by Lois Weber. Lois Weber was an early pioneering film director. She was the most powerful and well-paid film director, and that includes D.W. Griffith back in the teens. She was huge and very influential. So we're going to watch 3 of her films at the Newberry, or rather, people will watch them and we'll talk about them and their experiences at the Newberry. So that's Lois Weber, and then moving forward, we'll see what comes up. Send me your suggestions at any point. I would love for other seminars.
I would love to cover Lois Weber on a future.
I bet you will. Yeah, I'd love to
yeah,
hear it. I mean, really neat career too. I mean, that's another. You know, she also directed Mildred Harris, Chaplin's first wife,
right?
In seven films. I'm bad with details, but 6 or 7 films. Yeah, there's a connection there.
She's just fascinating, and a name that everybody should know. The women of this time period is a story that is not talked about enough. So I love that you're doing that. That sounds amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk today. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed this conversation. Where can people find you and learn what you're working on next?
Oh, just watch movies and read books. You don't need me. I've got a website, stephenjventurino.com, but it really just posts what it is I'm up to with the Newberry and moving forward. And then the Idiot's Guide that I published almost 10 years ago is still out there, and that's something that people could pick up if they wanted to. Look at literary theory, which is also really applicable to film theory. But really, the best way to move forward is just to watch things you like and be open to new stuff. Everybody should just go out there and watch a film, silent film, and have a drink and talk about it.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much, Stephen J. Venturino. And until next time, that's a wrap.
There isn't no one else but you.